settled. We want to save a lot of lives. As you know, in the past, we spent, could be $350 billion giving it to Ukraine. We got nothing in return, but we gave it to Ukraine. I ended up getting rare earth in return, even though I didn't spend money. And we are now selling weapons to NATO. We're not selling it to Ukraine. We're selling weapons at full price to NATO, as you know. They distribute those weapons probably to Ukraine for the most part. They're probably doing it to others also. But we're not involved in the war other than the fact that we are involved in a negotiation because people want us there. Ukraine wants us involved very much. Europe wants us involved. I have a great relationship with the countries of Europe. As you know, I took GDP. I took what they're spending as a percentage of GDP, but
So listen to those words again, and let them sink into your consciousness like poison dripping into clear water, because what you just heard was not merely political buffoonery or the usual Trumpian carnival of incoherence, but something far more sinister and morally grotesque, a distillation of everything that has rotted at the core of American conservative thought, transformed into foreign policy as mercantile transaction, where human lives become line items and genocide becomes a business inconvenience rather than a moral catastrophe. In November alone, 65 civilians were killed, and 372 were injured across 11 regions of Ukraine. And yet here stands the man who campaigned on ending this horror in 24 hours, now casually discussing weapons sales at full price, as though the screams of children in Kharkiv are merely background noise to a real estate negotiation. And you need to understand that this is not incompetence or ignorance, but the logical endpoint of a worldview that sees suffering as somebody else's problem until it affects the quarterly earnings of Lockheed Martin. The sheer audacity of complaining that America got nothing in return for aid to Ukraine while at least 10,287 civilians have been killed since Russia's invasion reveals the moral vacancy at the heart of Trumpism, this transactional nihilism dressed up as hard-headed realism that treats international solidarity as a sucker's game and views allies as marks to be squeezed rather than partners in the defense of democratic civilization against authoritarian aggression. And here's what should make your blood boil with the heat of 1,000 suns, what should propel you from your seat with righteous fury. Trump explained that NATO countries would acquire US-made weapons, including Patriot air defense missile systems, and that those countries would provide them to Ukraine, which means he's discovered a way to profit from Ukrainian desperation while maintaining plausible deniability about American involvement. A scheme so cynically brilliant in its cruelty that it could only emerge from the mind of someone who views human civilization as one giant zero-sum casino where the house always wins and the house is always America. This is the isolationist impulse repackaged as entrepreneurship, and we must recognize isolationism has endured well into the 20th century, in no small part because its multiple ideological strains broadened its political appeal. Which means Trump is tapping into something ancient and poisonous in the American psyche, that America First mentality that George Washington articulated and that Trump has perverted into something Washington would barely recognize, a nationalism so hollowed out that it cannot even conceive of moral obligations beyond the water's edge. When Trump says we're not involved in the war, other than the fact that we are involved in a negotiation because people want us there, he's performing a rhetorical sleight of hand so transparent it insults the intelligence of anyone paying attention, claiming non-involvement while simultaneously boasting about weapons sales and rare earth mineral extraction, and this doublespeak would be laughable if it weren't so chillingly effective at providing his base with permission to ignore 6.7 million people who have fled Ukraine, with 93% seeking refuge in EU countries, while 3.7 million remain internally displaced, because acknowledging their humanity would require conservatives to confront the moral bankruptcy of their entire ideological project. And wait, because here comes the part that should make you want to scream into the void until your voice gives out, the moment when he pivots to discussing NATO defense spending percentages as though this were the real issue, rather than the fact that June brought the highest monthly civilian casualties of the past 3 years, with 232 people killed and 1,343 wounded, and Russia launched 10 times more drones and missiles in June than in the same month last year. This is the conservative cost-benefit analysis applied to human suffering with surgical precision, the reduction of geopolitical crisis to a question of who pays what share, while cities are leveled and children are torn from their families. Women and children make up over 80% of the Ukrainian refugee population, and Trump stands there like some grotesque parody of a CFO explaining why the genocide division isn't pulling its weight this quarter. The language itself is diagnostic of the pathology because notice how Ukraine wants us involved very much, as though this were about desire rather than necessity, as though a nation fighting for its survival against an imperial power bent on erasing its existence were simply trying to get America's attention for the thrill of it rather than because. If U.S. assistance dried up, Ukraine would struggle to sustain its forces in a fight against Russia, which has far more resources and manpower. This rhetorical framing transforms Ukrainian agency into Ukrainian neediness, recasting a desperate struggle for national survival as a kind of international welfare dependency that justifies American extraction of concessions, and you can trace the through line from Reagan's welfare queen mythology straight to Trump's characterization of Ukraine as a supplicant state that should be grateful for whatever scraps America deigns to provide at full market price plus handling. But here's where it gets even more diabolical, and where you need to pay attention, because this matters more than almost anything else in understanding how conservatism has curdled into something unrecognizable, even to conservatives of a previous generation. Trump told Time magazine that the Middle East is an easier problem to handle than what's happening with Russia and Ukraine, which means he went into this thing thinking he could just bully everyone into submission with his legendary deal-making prowess and told the outlet, "Obviously, people know that when I said that, it was said in jest," about his claim to end the war in 24 hours, which is conservatism in its purest distilled form, the belief that complex historical conflicts rooted in centuries of geopolitical struggle can be resolved through the sheer force of American exceptionalism, wielded by a strong man unburdened by expertise or empathy. The fact that reality has brutally disproven this fantasy has done nothing to shake conservative faith in the underlying premise, because conservatism in 2024 is not a political philosophy, but a religious movement whose central tenet is that American power justifies itself and requires no moral framework beyond the assertion of dominance. And you want to talk about what Trump means when he says we're selling weapons at full price to NATO, as though this were some kind of brilliant innovation rather than a way to strike a balance on shifting the burden of Washington's role in the war to European allies, while maintaining a role in the conflict. This is disaster capitalism applied to humanitarian catastrophe, the monetization of Ukrainian suffering repackaged as American ingenuity, and the fact that the Netherlands announced an estimated $580 million package while Denmark, Norway, and Sweden confirmed they would purchase $500 million worth of U.S.-sourced equipment, means European nations are essentially paying the United States to do the right thing, which is the most American solution imaginable to a moral crisis, figuring out a way to make money off virtue while claiming the transaction proves our commitment to democratic values. The historical parallel here is unavoidable, and it should chill you to your bones because we have seen this movie before. We watched it play out in the 1930s when American isolationists insisted that European conflicts were none of our business and that getting involved would be a sucker's move. And from 1789 to 1941, the United States embraced an isolationist grand strategy to which Trump's basic impulses bear a strong resemblance, which means we're watching the resurrection of the very foreign policy approach that gave Hitler the breathing room to consolidate power and launch a genocidal campaign that consumed tens of millions of lives. Trump and his acolytes would deny this comparison with theatrical outrage, but the logic is identical. Treat foreign conflicts as transactional opportunities rather than moral imperatives. View allies as cost centers rather than partners in defending civilization. And above all, maintain the fiction that America can remain prosperous and secure while the world burns beyond our borders. What makes this particularly insidious is that Trump has found a way to thread the needle between his isolationist base and the demands of realpolitik by announcing a new delivery mechanism where NATO may choose to have certain weapons sent to other countries to get additional speed, where the country will release something which allows him to claim he's not directly arming Ukraine while simultaneously taking credit for weapons deliveries and profiting from the entire arrangement. This is having your isolationist cake and eating your interventionist profits too, and it represents a kind of ideological incoherence that would be politically fatal in any other era, but that thrives in our current moment, because conservative voters have been conditioned to accept contradiction as a feature rather than a bug, to embrace cognitive dissonance as proof of their leader's strategic brilliance rather than evidence of his moral vacuity. And notice how casually Trump mentions that we got nothing in return, while simultaneously bragging that he ended up getting rare earth in return, even though I didn't spend money, which is such a perfect encapsulation of Trumpian logic that it deserves to be bronzed and placed in a museum of American decline. We got nothing except we got something, but it doesn't count because we're still mad about not getting more. And also we're heroes for extracting concessions from a country fighting for its existence against genocidal aggression. The rare earth minerals comment is particularly telling because it reveals the extractive colonial mindset at the heart of contemporary conservatism, the belief that America's relationship with the rest of the world should be fundamentally exploitative, that our power gives us the right to demand tribute from nations desperate enough to need our help, and that this extraction of resources from the vulnerable represents shrewd negotiation rather than moral bankruptcy. The pivot to discussing GDP percentages and NATO spending is classic conservative misdirection, the rhetorical equivalent of someone complaining about the cost of fire insurance while their neighbor's house burns with children inside, and Trump delivers it with such unself-conscious crassness that you almost have to admire the sheer audacity of treating repeated large-scale, coordinated attacks on Ukraine's energy infrastructure that imperiled civilians as temperatures dropped to as low as -20 degrees Celsius, with more than 60% of the country's energy generation facilities damaged since March, as an accounting problem rather than a humanitarian catastrophe. This is conservatism stripped of any pretense to moral principle, conservatism as pure cost-benefit analysis, where the costs are measured in dollars and the benefits are measured in strategic advantage and human suffering, simply doesn't enter the equation, except as a variable that might affect American interests down the road. But here's what should really make you sick to your stomach. What should fill you with a sense of urgency about the stakes of this political moment? Trump's repeated criticism of Ukraine and United States funding for Kyiv, and his promise to end the war within a day, have prompted concerns among NATO allies about the compromises he might demand of Ukraine, which means our allies understand what many Americans apparently don't, which is that Trump's transactional approach to foreign policy represents an existential threat, not just to Ukraine but to the entire post-World War II international order that has prevented great power conflict for 8 decades. The Europeans are watching a man who claims to champion Western civilization actively undermine its foundational principles, and they're scrambling to figure out how to defend democratic values in a world where America has decided that values are for suckers and everything is for sale at full price. And we have to talk about what Trump means when he says Ukraine wants us involved and Europe wants us involved, because this framing is doing so much ideological work that it deserves extended analysis. By positioning American involvement as a response to foreign desire rather than as a moral imperative or strategic necessity, Trump is absolving America of any responsibility for the outcome, while simultaneously claiming credit for whatever success occurs, and this is the genius of conservative rhetoric in the Trump era. It creates a framework where America is simultaneously all-powerful and perpetually victimized, where we're strong enough to dictate terms but weak enough that everyone is taking advantage of us, and this contradiction doesn't need to be resolved because its purpose is not logical coherence, but emotional satisfaction for an audience that feels aggrieved by the modern world. The mention that I have a great relationship with the countries of Europe is particularly galling because treating NATO as transactional and skipping major forums has allowed China and other rivals to fill the leadership vacuum left by the United States. Perch means Trump's great relationship consists of him demanding tribute, while our adversaries expand their influence in the spaces America once occupied. This is the foreign policy equivalent of a protection racket, where we're simultaneously the mafia and the mark threatening our allies while getting played by our enemies, and the fact that Trump thinks this represents diplomatic success tells you everything you need to know about conservative foreign policy in 2024, which is that it has completely abandoned any coherent theory of American power in favor of vibes-based nationalism that privileges the feeling of dominance over the reality of strategic advantage. But wait, because we haven't even gotten to the most obscene part of this entire performance, which is that while Trump is complaining about spending and boasting about weapons sales at full price, humanitarian operations have been attacked with aid workers killed almost tripling this year from 4 in 2022 and 5 in 2023 to 11 so far in 2024. An estimated 1.5 million civilians in Russian-occupied areas remain out of reach, and the failure to deliver assistance in these areas could have dire consequences, especially in winter. This is what Trump's transactional foreign policy actually means in practice: humanitarian workers dying while trying to reach desperate civilians who face freezing to death or starvation, because American policy treats their suffering as a negotiating chip rather than a moral imperative, and Trump stands there bragging about NATO spending percentages like this is some kind of evidence of his acumen rather than his sociopathy. The conservative worldview on display here is fundamentally ahistorical and dangerously naive about how power actually works in the international system, and I want you to understand this because it's crucial. Trump's rejection of international cooperation is isolating the United States, undermining its long-term security, and eroding its ability to shape a world that benefits American families, workers, and businesses, which means the very policies Trump claims will protect American interests are actually destroying American power by teaching the entire world that America is an unreliable partner that will abandon its commitments the moment they become inconvenient or insufficiently profitable. This is conservatism eating itself, the ideology of American exceptionalism transformed into a suicide pact, where we prove our exceptionalism by refusing to lead and demonstrate our power by abandoning our allies. And you need to recognize that when Trump says we're not involved in the war other than the fact that we are involved in a negotiation, he's not just being contradictory but actively constructing a reality where American power exists in a quantum state, simultaneously engaged and disengaged, depending on which framing serves Trump's immediate rhetorical needs. This is the epistemological crisis of conservatism, made manifest in foreign policy, the belief that reality is whatever you say it is, that contradiction is strength, that hypocrisy is irrelevant as long as you maintain the emotional performance of dominance. We're watching the dissolution of any shared framework for evaluating truth claims in real time, and it's happening on a stage where the consequences are measured in body counts and refugee flows rather than just political polls. The fact that Russian forces continue to inch forward in eastern Ukraine, using brutal human wave attacks that in November produced the highest number of Russian casualties since the start of the war, while Trump discusses weapons sales, should fill you with incandescent rage because this is not abstract geopolitical chess, but actual human beings being ground up in Putin's war machine, while America's president treats their struggle as a business opportunity. Every word Trump speaks about Ukraine being a transaction, about getting nothing in return, about NATO paying full price, is a negation of those lives and an affirmation of the conservative belief that some human beings simply don't count, that their suffering is not real in the same way that American suffering is real, that moral obligations end at the border unless there's profit to be extracted. And here's the thing that should haunt your dreams and fuel your activism. J.D. Vance stated in 2022 that I don't really care what happens to Ukraine one way or another, which means the Vice President of the United States has openly declared his indifference to whether a democratic nation survives or is absorbed into a revanchist empire, and this is not a disqualifying statement in contemporary conservatism, but rather a credential proving his authenticity as an America First nationalist. We have reached a point where admitting that you don't care about genocide is politically advantageous on the right, where moral indifference is reframed as hard-headed realism and empathy is dismissed as weakness, and this represents such a complete inversion of traditional American values that it should terrify anyone who understands that the protection of human rights and democratic governance is not merely idealistic flourish, but existential necessity. When Trump claims they're probably doing it to others also, regarding where NATO distributes weapons, he's revealing the paranoid logic that animates conservative isolationism, the belief that everyone is running a con and America is the mark, unless we're ruthless enough to turn the tables. And this worldview makes cooperation impossible because it assumes bad faith on the part of all actors and treats solidarity as a scam. Cross-border trade, investment, and migration have made the world far more prosperous than could ever have been imagined, but fragmentation will make us poorer, and we must resist the play's overall theme that isolationism will make every nation great again, which means the policy Trump is pursuing doesn't just fail morally, but fails practically. It will make America poorer and weaker and more isolated, while generating massive human suffering as a kind of policy exhaust that conservatives have learned to simply ignore. The comparison to the 1930s is not hyperbole or liberal hysteria, but sober historical analysis, and if you think that's overstated, consider that the incoming Trump administration promises a very large increase in tariffs, perhaps to levels last seen during the mid-1930s in the Depression, abandoning the liberalizing program developed during the New Deal in favor of something like the high-tariff worlds of Harding-Hoover isolationism in the 1920s, which means we're not just analogizing to the interwar period, but actively recreating its policy framework with the same mix of economic nationalism and geopolitical withdrawal that created the conditions for catastrophe. History doesn't repeat, but it sure as hell rhymes, and right now it's rhyming in a distinctly Teutonic minor key that should make anyone with even a passing knowledge of the 1930s deeply, deeply afraid. What Trump is articulating in this clip is not just a policy preference, but an entire theory of international relations premised on the belief that America has no moral obligations beyond its borders, that alliances are transactional arrangements to be renegotiated or abandoned based on quarterly returns, and that the suffering of foreign populations is simply not our problem unless it affects American interests in ways that can be measured and monetized. This represents such a radical departure from both the liberal internationalism of the post-war era and the morally grounded realism of earlier conservative foreign policy that it constitutes a revolutionary transformation of American grand strategy, and the revolution is not toward greater justice or more effective projection of power, but toward a kind of nationalist solipsism, where the rest of the world exists only as a stage for American performances of dominance. And here's the final thing you need to understand about this moment, the truth that should galvanize you into action and sustain you through the long struggle ahead. What Trump is doing isn't working even on its own terms. Ukraine, backed by Europe, has been clear that it is not prepared to accept terms that amount to surrender, while Russia has given no signal that it will back off its maximalist demands, which means Trump's transactional approach has produced neither the quick resolution he promised, nor the strategic advantage he claimed to seek, and Putin's evident refusal to make any substantive concessions at his talks with Trump's envoys proves that treating foreign policy as a real estate deal doesn't work when your negotiating partner is a dictator with imperial ambitions who understands that Trump's isolationist base will force him to eventually abandon Ukraine, regardless of what terms are offered. Putin is playing chess while Trump is playing Monopoly, and the casualties of this mismatch are measured in 10,287 civilians killed and 19,444 injured, with actual figures likely far higher. This is the moral and strategic bankruptcy of contemporary conservatism laid bare for anyone willing to look directly at it. A worldview so corroded by transactional thinking and nationalist paranoia that it cannot even conceive of solidarity as anything other than weakness, a political movement so committed to the performance of dominance that it mistakes cruelty for strength and abandonment for shrewdness, and a leader so fundamentally incapable of empathy that he can discuss weapons sales and GDP percentages while cities burn and children freeze and millions flee their homes in the largest displacement crisis in Europe since World War II. And when you've finished processing your rage, when you've moved from shock to understanding to determination, you need to recognize that this isn't just about Ukraine or Trump or this particular moment, but about whether America will continue to be a force for democratic values in the world or will complete its transformation into exactly the kind of nationalist authoritarian power that our grandparents fought a world war to defeat, and that choice is being made right now in real time, while Trump complains about getting nothing in return for the privilege of defending human dignity against genocidal aggression.